You ever step outside on a quiet morning, hot coffee in hand, the kind of morning where the world still feels half asleep, and suddenly get the gut feeling that something's just off? That was me. One peaceful Thursday not long ago. Birds chirping, sun just creeping over the rooftops, the smell of damp earth in the air. But then I looked down at my front yard and stopped cold. My lawn, usually patchy and crust-dry by morning, looked like it had been through a monsoon. Puddles mirrored the sky, mud clung to the grass like it had rained for hours, and the ground squished under my slippers like a soaked sponge. I bent down, brushed my hand over the hose lying limply across the pavement. It was warm, not from the sun. This was early, the kind of early where even the asphalt hasn't had time to bake. Number this warmth meant recent use. Problem was, I hadn't used the hose. Not that morning. Not the night before. Not all week. And here's where it gets weird. I live alone. No kids, no house guests, no secret garden fairies sneaking out for a midnight watering session. It's just me, my coffee, and a hose that apparently decided to live a life of its own. I don't even have an irrigation system. Never bothered with one. Too expensive, too fussy, too unnecessary for a guy who barely keeps a single tomato plant alive. So the idea of sprinklers kicking on by accident? That theory got flushed out quick. What was left was a puzzle. One that smelled faintly of wet grass and mystery. I chalked it up to maybe a neighbor accidentally using the wrong hose in the dark. A one-time fluke. One of those weird things you let slide because confronting it feels more exhausting than accepting it. I went inside, trying to shrug it off. But the feeling sat in my gut like cold oatmeal. That's when the water bill came. Not a little increase. Not a few bucks. I'm talking triple. It looked like I'd been running a public swimming pool out of my backyard. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't just a weird incident. This was something deeper, something sneakier. Somebody was stealing my water. My first instinct? Go neighbor to neighbor. Ask questions. Keep it casual. Hey, notice anything strange lately? People were friendly, kind of too friendly. They gave polite smiles. Some offered theories about underground leaks or ghost pipes. But they didn't know. Or if they did, they weren't saying. Except for one person. Brenda. And I don't use that name lightly. If you've ever had the misfortune of living next to someone who thinks they're the self-appointed ruler of your street, then you know exactly what I mean. Brenda had moved in just a few months ago, but you'd think she'd founded the neighborhood. Right from day one, she came in hot, with laminated HOA pamphlets, unsolicited welcome notes, that read more like instructions, and of course the infamous clipboard. Always with that clipboard. She marched up and down the sidewalk like a drill sergeant, taking notes on mailbox placement and lawn length, issuing recommendations on paint colors, and stopping delivery drivers to critique how they parked. The first time I met her, she didn't introduce herself. She just asked if I'd considered trimming my hedge to a less aggressive shape. I hadn't even known hedges could be aggressive. She wasn't on the HOA board, not officially, but somehow she acted like she was born to wear the crown, and nobody challenged her. Not the older couple next door who just wanted peace. Not the young family 2 houses down, who were too busy with their newborn to care. Everyone tiptoed around Brenda, like she was a landmine in floral print. It didn't take long for her to turn the street into her own kingdom of unwritten rules. Still, for all her busybody energy, I never imagined she'd stoop to something as petty and illegal as water theft. That is, until I started seeing the patterns. The hose, always slightly askew. The mornings my front path was damp, even when skies were dry. The spike in my bill. The smug glances I caught from across the street whenever I bent down to examine the hose. The way she seemed to know things no one told her. Like how long someone's grass had gone uncut, or what day someone forgot to roll in their trash bins. She had eyes everywhere, but apparently she also had very sticky fingers. What sealed it wasn't a grand revelation. It was the slow, creeping certainty that builds when you know something's wrong, even if no one else believes you. And I knew beyond any doubt Brenda had declared war. A silent, sneaky, hose-stealing war. What she didn't know, though, was that I was done playing polite. This battle was just getting started. The day it all became undeniable wasn't anything special. It was a Saturday afternoon like any other. Sunny, warm, the kind of weather that made you want to believe everything was good and normal and neighborly. I'd just come back from the grocery store, juggling a bag of oranges in one hand and a six-pack of soda in the other, when I pulled into my driveway and caught a glimpse of something that stopped me mid-turn. There, right in the middle of my yard, like it was the most natural thing in the world, stood Brenda. She was wearing that wide-brimmed sun hat she loved so much, the one that made her look like she was auditioning for a gardening magazine. Her blouse, floral, loud and proud, fluttered in the breeze as she crouched over the spigot on the side of my house. My hose was in her hands, fully uncoiled and stretched across the lawn like it belonged to her. She didn't even bother looking around first, like she'd done this 100 times, and no one had dared stop her. With perfect ease, she dragged the hose across the grass, connected it to a bright orange portable pressure washer, and started power washing her front steps like it was her weekend ritual. I didn't even get out of the car. I just sat there, jaw slack, oranges shifting in the passenger seat as the bag rolled to the floor. She glanced up, saw me parked just feet away, and smiled. Not sheepishly, not apologetically. No. Brenda gave me the kind of smile you give an old friend when you bump into them at the store. Then, as if to sprinkle some salt into the wound, she actually waved and called out, "Hope you don't mind, just a quick rinse." Her voice was chipper, light, like this was just a casual favor between pals. And before I could process the sheer audacity of it, she turned her back and kept spraying. Water shot out of the nozzle with impressive force, hitting her brick steps and sending mist into the air. It glistened in the sunlight like something out of a commercial for luxury cleaning products. Except this wasn't her water. It was mine. I sat behind the wheel, hands clenched around the steering wheel, mind spinning. There are moments in life where your instincts split in two. Fight or flight, speak or stay silent, knock on the window and demand an answer, or go inside and pretend none of it ever happened. I chose the path of least resistance. I carried my groceries inside and spent the next hour staring at my kitchen faucet like it had betrayed me. But avoidance only works for so long. Later that day, I decided to do what any reasonable person would do. I walked over, knocked on her door, and braced myself. She opened it with the same sunny expression she wore earlier, like I'd come to borrow sugar or ask for gardening tips. I kept my tone polite. Calm. I asked if she'd been having issues with her own water line. Maybe her spigot wasn't working, or maybe her hose wasn't reaching. I left the door wide open for her to explain herself, to admit some minor misunderstanding. But Brenda didn't even blink. She laughed, an airy, dismissive sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, and said, "Oh no, I just like your hose better. The pressure is amazing, way better than mine. Honestly, I figured it's all community property anyway, right?" Community property. She said it with such conviction, like she believed it. Like the rules of personal ownership didn't apply to her, as long as she found something useful on someone else's lawn. I blinked, unsure if I'd heard correctly. She smiled again, leaned slightly in the doorway, and added, "We're all neighbors here. We should be sharing things. That's what a good neighborhood does." I could feel the polite mask on my face start to slip. I reminded her, as gently as I could, that the hose was on my side of the property, connected to my house and drawing from my water line, that I would have appreciated it if she had at least asked. Her eyes narrowed slightly, just a flicker. But then she tilted her head and said something that made my blood simmer. "Well, I'm sure the HOA won't mind. We're all supposed to be friendly after all." And just like that, she closed the door. No apology, no promise not to do it again. Just a condescending smile, a passive-aggressive remark about being neighborly, and the unmistakable click of the deadbolt sliding into place. I stood there for a moment, processing the sheer nerve. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a one-off. Brenda had made a choice. She saw something she wanted, and decided it was hers for the taking. Not only that, she justified it with a warped version of suburban unity, as if the fact that we shared a zip code meant my hose, and by extension my water bill, belonged to her. And the worst part, she wasn't even trying to hide it. She was so confident, so self-righteous, that she genuinely didn't believe she was doing anything wrong. Or if she did, she just didn't care. Back inside my house, I sent an email to the HOA, complete with a brief explanation, a snapshot of my bloated water bill, and a request for clarification on this supposed community property policy Brenda had invoked. I didn't expect much, but I held on to a shred of hope. A few days later I got their reply. Short, polite, completely useless. "Thank you for your concern. At this time we encourage all neighbors to resolve minor disputes amicably without HOA intervention. Translation: deal with it yourself." So I did. I went down to the hardware store and bought a lock for the hose. Nothing fancy, just a basic screw-on model to prevent unauthorized use. I figured if I made it inaccessible, the problem would vanish. Brenda couldn't use what she couldn't reach. Problem solved. For one night. The next morning the lock was gone. Not removed. Not loosened. Gone. Clean cut straight through the metal like it had met a pair of bolt cutters. I stared at the sliced remains in disbelief, as if maybe, just maybe, someone else might have done it. But deep down, I already knew. Across the street, as if on cue, Brenda was once again out front, hose in hand, blasting away at her driveway like she was filming a car wash commercial. She didn't even pretend to be surprised. Didn't flinch when I stepped outside. I walked over, trying to keep my voice steady, and asked about the missing lock. She looked at me like I'd asked if the sky was blue. "Oh, that thing." It was a safety hazard. Someone could trip. I took care of it. Then she smiled. That same infuriating smile that said, "You can't touch me." And she went back to scrubbing the chrome on her tires, humming to herself like nothing had happened. That's when it hit me. Brenda didn't think she was bending the rules. She believed she was the rules. And if I thought a polite conversation or a padlock was going to stop her, then I clearly didn't understand who I was dealing with. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The following morning I stepped outside to a scene that could have been ripped from the climax of a psychological thriller. The hose lock, which I had screwed on just yesterday, brand new, solid metal, supposed to be tamper-proof, was gone. Not removed, not lying innocently on the ground, like someone had fiddled with it and decided against using it. No, this was different. What remained of the lock lay in two clean, jagged pieces near the spigot, sliced right through. As if someone had come under cover of darkness with a pair of bolt cutters, made their incision, and vanished like a ghost. Except this wasn't a ghost story. This was a suburb. And there weren't many people in the neighborhood brazen enough to treat private property like their own personal playground. I didn't have to run DNA tests on the handle to know who had done it. My instincts screamed the name before my brain caught up. Brenda. And just as the last thread of doubt tried to cling to logic, I looked across the street and saw her. She was already out there, in the same hat and blouse as the day before, hose in hand like a trophy, blasting her SUV with theatrical flair. The water sparkled in the morning sun as it arced and crashed against her windshield. She was smiling, twirling the nozzle like a conductor leading a symphony of suds. I watched her for a long moment. It wasn't just the act of stealing water anymore. It was the smugness, the outright gall of doing it again, without even the decency to pretend she wasn't caught. She wanted me to see it. She wanted me to know I was powerless, that my bill, my tools, my attempts at boundaries meant nothing to her. I walked toward her with slow, deliberate steps, my jaw clenched tight. She didn't stop spraying, didn't even pause. I stood a few feet away and asked, calmly, firmly, why she'd cut the lock. Her eyes danced with that same playful condescension. That thing. Oh, sweetheart, it was dangerous. I did you a favor. Imagine if someone tripped. Lawsuit waiting to happen. She chuckled as if this entire exchange was a joke she'd already won. My fingers curled slightly, but I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't let her bait me. I simply turned around and walked back across the street, my steps heavier than before, my heart pounding with a quiet storm I hadn't felt in years. That evening, I stood in the center of my living room, staring at the hose lock remains on the counter, and made a decision. I'd played nice. I'd tried the logical route. I'd submitted a formal request, asked questions, set boundaries. And I had been met with arrogance, entitlement, and outright theft. That's when the idea hit me, not out of rage, but clarity. If reason wouldn't work, then maybe it was time to get creative. Not petty, not illegal, but clever, very clever. I began by asking a few subtle questions around town. Nothing that would raise alarms. Just harmless curiosity about utility setups, water rerouting, and pressure control. The pieces began to fall into place slowly, forming a plan that felt equal parts genius and poetic. The break I needed came when I passed a construction site on the edge of our development. A temporary crew had moved in to upgrade the drainage system for a future housing expansion. Out back, half hidden behind a line of orange cones, was exactly what I needed. A large industrial sewage containment tank. Not the kind you'd hook up for a porta potty or a weekend festival. No, this was a heavy-duty beast, capable of storing the kind of waste that would haunt a person's sinuses for weeks. I pulled over and struck up a conversation with one of the workers. Told him I was a homeowner conducting a small water flow experiment. Something about irrigation systems and soil drainage. He raised an eyebrow, but after a bit of small talk and a crisp 50 slipped into his palm, he shrugged and said, "Sure. Just don't mess with the pump." That was all I needed. Back home, I spent the evening rigging together a setup that would make an engineer proud and a prankster weep tears of joy. A splitter valve, buried just beneath the grass, disguised under a small decorative rock. One line still connected to the house for normal use. The other, routed underground, behind the hedges, and straight into the sewage tank. I even tested the setup with a sealed container first. One flick of the switch, and the result was powerful. A brown, sludgy jet of unholy liquid erupted with force. The smell was indescribable, like wet dog rolled in compost and aged in a porta-john at a summer fair. It was disgusting. It was perfect. Now all that was left to do was wait. I left the hose coiled neatly, just like always. Accessible. Inviting. The bait was set. The trap loaded. The next morning, right on time, I heard the faint hiss of the spigot turning. My stomach coiled with anticipation. She didn't even hesitate. She dragged the hose across the yard like it belonged to her, all in that same routine, as if she were clocking in for a job. But today, she'd added something new, a fancy rotating sprinkler. It was the kind with chrome arms that spun in perfect circles, designed to evenly mist your entire lawn with minimal effort. She set it dead center in the grass, turned on the valve, and stood back proudly to admire her work. The sound was subtle at first, Just a low gurgle, a strange bubbling, like something wasn't quite right. She tilted her head in confusion. Then it hit. A surge of brown liquid burst from the sprinkler's arms in a violent spinning blast. It arced high into the air before descending in a wide circle, drenching her porch, her front lawn, and her beautiful white wicker furniture. She screamed. Not a short gasp or a yelp, but a full-throated wail of horror and disgust. She stumbled backward, slipped on the now slippery grass, and landed with a wet thud. The sprinkler kept spinning, spraying wave after wave of sewage across the yard like a grimy carousel of karma. From windows up and down the street, faces appeared. Curtains twitched. Doors opened. Someone dropped a mug. A child pointed and laughed before being pulled quickly back inside. And Brenda. She was a mess. Covered in sludge, shrieking, slipping, trying to wrestle the hose off the spigot with shaking hands. She finally got it turned off, dropped the hose like it had bitten her, and stood there, panting, dripping, furious. But there was no apology that day, no sarcastic wave, no friendly, hope you don't mind. There was only silence, broken by the distant sound of someone across the street laughing too loudly to pretend it was anything else. Brenda didn't look at me as she stormed inside. She didn't speak. She didn't threaten. And for the first time since she moved in, she finally realized this wasn't her kingdom. Not anymore. The war she had started with a stolen drop had ended with a flood she never saw coming. For 2 full days after the sewage sprinkler incident, Brenda's house stood silent, its once vigilant windows now closed and shaded, the porch light dark even after sunset. No sun hat, no hose, no self-appointed patrols. Just eerie stillness, like the aftermath of a natural disaster. You could feel it in the air, a thick, invisible silence, the kind that wraps around the neighborhood and makes everyone speak a little softer. Her front yard, once obsessively manicured, was now a stained battlefield. Her wicker furniture, formerly pristine, lay toppled and streaked with streaks of brown that no pressure washer could ever erase from memory. People whispered, but no one dared go near. Not out of fear. No, that power had been stripped from her. It was pity, maybe, or awe, or simply the unspoken rule that when a monarch falls, you give them space to crawl through the wreckage of their pride alone. But that quiet didn't fool me. Brenda wasn't done. She wasn't built to surrender. Her silence wasn't retreat. It was the pause between storm fronts. And sure enough, on the 3rd afternoon, there came a knock at my door, crisp and rehearsed. When I opened it, I wasn't surprised to find her standing there. But what did surprise me were the 2 people flanking her. HOA board members, clipboard guy and his assistant, both stiff-backed and trying very hard not to look uncomfortable. Brenda had dressed like she was walking into a courtroom drama. Blazer, glossy hair pulled tight, a manila folder in hand, bursting at the seams with what she likely believed was evidence of her victimhood. Her face was hard set, her mouth tight with righteousness. The board members introduced themselves with forced smiles and informed me that they were here to discuss an escalating property dispute and a possible biohazard concern. Brenda stood slightly behind them, arms crossed, eyes burning holes through me. I invited them to speak on the porch. Brenda immediately interrupted, claiming she didn't feel safe stepping onto my property, a laughable statement coming from someone who had spent weeks trespassing across it with a hose. Clipboard guy shuffled his notes and began listing Brenda's accusations. That I had intentionally tampered with utilities, created a dangerous environment, and subjected her to public humiliation. She claimed the incident had caused her emotional distress, had endangered her health, and, this part was rich, left a lingering odor in her home's foundation. Every word was wrapped in legal jargon she likely found online at 2 a.m, searching, "How to sue your neighbor for making you smell bad." When they finished their list of complaints and gave me a copy of her official written grievance, I simply nodded and asked if they'd like to see the other side of the story. I handed them my folder. Inside were copies of the HOA's own bylaws, water bills showing spikes aligned with Brenda's usage, and a timeline of events that made it clear how long this had been escalating. And best of all, I'd included testimonies. Other neighbors had stepped forward, quietly but decisively, providing written statements about Brenda's behavior. Not just the hose theft, but everything. The threats, the nitpicking, the unsolicited notes on their driveways. One neighbor even recounted how Brenda had tried to measure their grass with a ruler and left a typed letter when it exceeded 3 inches. As they read, I watched the board members' faces shift. Not dramatically, but enough to tell me the narrative had cracked. Clipboard guy raised his eyebrows at the highlighted HOA clause, section 4.2b, which explicitly prohibited the use of another resident's utilities without consent. Brenda, now visibly sweating beneath her foundation, tried to interrupt, her voice rising in pitch as she accused me of falsifying events, of orchestrating a smear campaign, of manipulating neighbors against her. But she was no longer steering the conversation. The assistant leaned in and whispered something into Clipboard guy's ear. They wrapped up the visit quickly, telling me they'd need to conduct a formal review and would hold a special meeting later in the week to discuss the issue. Brenda didn't take that well. As soon as they stepped off the porch, she whirled on me, venom in her voice. "Everyone's going to know what kind of person you really are," she hissed. I met her glare without flinching. "They already do," I replied. She turned sharply, heels stomping against the pavement, and disappeared into her house without another word. But I knew this wouldn't be the end. It never is with people like her. That night, I typed up a calm, factual summary of everything that had happened and posted it to the same neighborhood forum where her hose crimes had first gone viral. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't mock her. I simply laid out the truth. How I had tried to address the issue civilly. How I'd reached out to the HOA. How I'd taken steps to protect my property. And how every action had been in response to repeated violations. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. Dozens of comments poured in. People shared their own stories about Brenda. Some had stayed quiet until now, afraid to rock the boat. But with the floodgates open, they let loose. One neighbor even offered to mow my lawn for a week just to say thanks. Another left a pie on my porch with a note that simply said, "You're a legend." By the time the HOA's special meeting arrived, Brenda was no longer the queen of the street. She was its cautionary tale. Her allies had thinned to none. The meeting wasn't public, but word spread fast. She showed up with more folders, more printed screenshots, more legal bluster. But it couldn't hold against the weight of evidence. The board formally warned her for multiple violations, fined her $500, and informed her that any further incidents would result in suspension of her HOA privileges. They didn't apologize to me, but they no longer tried to shield her either. They knew the tide had turned. For a while after that, Brenda was a ghost. She didn't wave. She didn't yell. She didn't patrol the sidewalks. She walked her dog with her head down, avoiding eye contact, moving like someone trying to fade into the background of a life they used to control. Her hose stayed curled, untouched, a plastic reminder that power could be lost as quickly as it was seized. But people like Brenda don't go quietly. She had one last move, one final desperate grasp at control. A week later, a city inspector knocked on my door. Brenda had filed a report claiming I'd illegally installed a sewage connection. The man stepped onto my lawn, clipboard in hand, and asked to see the setup. I walked him through it without hesitation. When he saw the temporary line, clearly disconnected and above board, he let out a sharp laugh. "Well," he said, "that's a new one." I offered him a bottle of water. He grinned. as long as it's not from the hose. That should have been the end of it. But Brenda couldn't bear the humiliation. Days later, without announcement, a moving truck appeared. Workers hauled out her patio furniture, her countless potted plants, her notorious pink flamingo. She didn't say goodbye, didn't speak to anyone. She simply vanished, leaving behind only the ghosts of arguments and a legacy of neighborhood trauma. The couple who bought her house showed up 2 days later, young, cheerful, with a toddler in tow and a tray of cookies in hand. They introduced themselves with warmth, asked if it was okay to use their hose hookup, and laughed when I nearly cried with relief. The street felt lighter, calmer, the kind of place it had always wanted to be. And yet part of me stayed ready, because peace, real peace, is never guaranteed. It must be guarded. Brenda may have moved on, but there are more Brendas in the world, entitled, arrogant, looking for a place to plant their clipboard and claim their throne. But not here. Not anymore. Not while there's still someone on this block who remembers what it means to say, enough is enough.